Shalom from Jerusalem. This is TV7's Israel at War update. And as we continue to deliberate the latest from the Middle East, as well as Israel in particular, it's always important to remember that 138 days ago, the Islamist terror groups from the Hamas-led Gaza Strip launched an onslaught on southern Israel, declaring war by perpetrating a massacre, murdering some 1,200 mostly civilians, wounding over 4,800 others, and kidnapping 246 individuals, including entire families, elderly, women, men, children, and infants. 134 of them remain in Hamas captivity to date. Let's now turn to our TV7 editor-at-large, Mr. Amir Oren. Amir, what can you tell us about the latest?
So the major story is still the uncertainty over the fate of the hostage deal, hostages in return for prisoners released from Israeli jails, and especially a sort of a pause or a ceasefire, which Hamas demands. The Hamas demand also includes a complete cessation of hostilities and a withdrawal of Israeli troops from Gaza, but this is obviously unrealistic and is not going to survive if there is a deal. A Hamas delegation headed to Cairo. The problem is they represent the political bureau of Hamas based in Doha, in Qatar, and it is not certain at all that they can represent the military, actually terrorist wing of Hamas, the Qassam brigades, based in Gaza and headed by Yahya Sinwar, who has not been heard from for the last 2 weeks. Now, the fighting continues in North Gaza, that is in Gaza City and its vicinity, in the central camps of Gaza, and in the south, in Khan Yunis. Almost every day, the IDF publishes the name of another casualty, another Israeli soldiers fallen in the fighting. Most of them are reservists, some are conscripts. The latest news to come out of Gaza is that the IDF, or to be more precise, Division 98, the elite units division of commando and paratroop brigades, has discovered and destroyed a tunnel which was used exclusively by the senior leadership of Hamas. No names have been disclosed in that regard, but it turns out that this is a kilometer, or was, because it was destroyed, it was a kilometer-long tunnel which costs millions of shekels to build and maintain. And the 98th Division penetrated it, fought some of the Hamas guards there, killed them, and then found a lot of weapons and documents, and finally destroyed it, with more to come.
Thank you, Mr. Owen. Let's now turn to the commander of the Israeli Air Force Task Force for Air and Missile Defense, namely Brigadier General in Reserve, Doron Gavish. It's good to see you, General. I'd like to ask you about the more broad sense of things. We saw that the last casualty, unfortunately, of the IDF operating comes from the Nachal Brigade, which operates currently in the northern Gaza Strip, an area that is not functioning as a military contingent, rather splinter cells which are currently being mopped up, various terrorists popping up from different locations, shooting one RPG or throwing a grenade and then trying to escape the wrath of the forces pursuing them. Where is this going, and to what degree is it realistic to get to a point where these various splinter cells will be entirely eradicated, if at all?
Well, indeed, Jonathan, this is a very good question. The situation, as we all know, is that mainly in the center and the northern part of Israel, The IDF is in control of those areas, but being in control doesn't mean that there are not those groups. And as you just mentioned them, and the Hamas, at least on these areas, basically in all the areas, shifted more to fight something like a guerrilla fight. They were much more organized before of it, but we know that out of their 24 battalions, they are left now with 6 or 5 battalions, which is, of course, significant, but in a way they did change their way of fighting, and this is a very complex challenge for the IDF, but it is not a surprise. This is something that the IDF was expecting to it, and I think it is dealing with it quite in an effective manner, mainly in the northern part, as we said, of the Gaza Strip. The story is, of course, still Khan Yunis. It is still the leaders of the Hamas. You also mentioned that we don't hear, and Amir also mentioned it, that we don't hear about the leader of the Hamas, Sinwar, for quite a long time, almost 2 weeks. And it is believed that still the leaders of the Hamas are in this area of Khan Yunis, and the fight is going on there. We have to remember that the 98th Division is the one who is leading the fight, which is division of special forces. All the brigades under this division, which are operating in this area, are special forces. And the IDF is almost also in control, at least on, let's say, above the sea level in these areas, but still there are those tunnels and the challenging ones. And of course, the question is Rafah, and what would be done with Rafah from a military point of view. There is no question. We all understand that some of the Hamas terrorist leaders evacuated themselves to those areas. And if the IDF wants to still gain the goals, as we discussed about them so many times, Rafah probably would have to be part of it, unless, of course, there would be a deal that would be, discussed with everyone, that the Hamas will decide to stop the war, to go back to a peaceful way, which we probably don't believe that something like this would happen. So from a military point of view, Khan Yunis and Rafah, this is the next challenge.
It's important to mention, and I think for the sake of our viewers, when we're talking about the city of Khan Yunis, there are 2 brigades or companies or battalions that have been operating there particularly and have now been disintegrated largely, with splinter cells now trying to once again, as General Gavish just mentioned, operate within a certain sort of a guerrilla warfare. But nonetheless, when we're talking about Rafah, there's still 4 battalions there, as part of a single brigade that is preparing for the day that the IDF may well receive the political decision to move forward and attack those terrorists, something that obviously will spell the end of the Islamist Hamas as a viable force to contend with other potential alternatives within the Gaza Strip, something that will challenge its very existence, because its weakening will sprout out the other forces, the other clans that are rival to it, and seek to eradicate it completely the moment Israel would disengage from that territory. But nonetheless, when we're talking about Yahya Sinwar, the fact that he hasn't been there for 2 weeks, we also still have another individual operating there called Mohammed Dif, who is the leader of the Izz al-Din al-Qassam brigades, which Mr. Oren mentioned earlier. These are the fighting contingents or frameworks of the Islamist Hamas, and they continue to operate very much as a fighting force in many of those territories that are not still penetrated by the IDF, and therefore we do need to somewhat highlight there is an influence, and it's a symbol to eradicate or eliminate Yahya Sinwar, but he is not the only one that needs to be taken off the card deck or whatever you'd like to call that. But let's now turn to Brigadier General or retired Brigadier General Mark Kimmett, formerly the U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Political and Military Affairs. It's very good to see you, General. I'd like to hear your perspective on the latest, since we do hear, following the attempt by Algiers to pass a UN Security Council resolution in a call upon Israel to ceasefire, basically, something that the United States vetoed, highlighting the fact that this resolution did not even call to condemn Hamas for its atrocities committed during the 7th of October massacre, which sparked the entire conflict to begin with. At the same time, it did highlight, particularly Linda Thomas-Greenfield, the U.S. ambassador at the UN, that Washington remains vigorously opposed to the state of Israel launching a ground offensive into the border town of Rafah due to humanitarian considerations.
Well, first of all, the best part that's going on right now is that America's greatest virtue in this case, its short attention span, has kept all of these issues off the front page. 6 weeks ago, these types of issues were covering the front page. Now America's moved on to other issues such as Nikki Haley's upcoming primary, some of the sordid details around the Trump hearings. And I didn't even know, because I hadn't seen it on the news, that there was even a UN resolution being considered until I saw Linda on the television set for a brief glimpse last night. So in terms of American popular opinion, you don't see the uprisings or the protests anymore for either the Israeli side or for the Palestinian side. I think I bring that up because that gives the administration a lot of room to maneuver, so that they're not necessarily listening to public dissent or public argument in terms of how they've got to influence the situation. Particularly important for Biden, who could very well lose Michigan with its heavy Arab population. And that being a key battleground state, he's got to keep it off the news. Okay, that said, I'd say that the three American concerns right now are, will Israel live up to its commitment, or Netanyahu's commitment, that there will be a humanitarian plan in place before going into Rafah? Obviously, America is concerned about the status of the hostages, but there's also a growing concern inside the Beltway of a perception that Netanyahu's next sights will not be on Rafah alone, but will also be against Hezbollah to push them back behind the Litani River. It is being perceived, and it's being printed as provocative, unnecessary, something that can be taken care of at a different time. But if in fact that happens, that would poke the quiescent bear Hassan Nasrallah and potentially bring Hezbollah into the fight and making it a much larger conflict than it already is. But by and large, I think the fact that this is off the front page gives the American administration and the American policy more flexibility to focus on the problem and not the reactions at home.
Indeed. Mr. Owen, I'd like to, by that, also divert our attention northward. Today at approximately 9:40 a.m., there were reports of a precision strike in the city of Damascus, a neighborhood that is heavily dominated by Iranians, and also the same neighborhood where Iman Moghnia, the military commander of Hezbollah, was eliminated in. Two individuals were killed in that very pinpointed strike. The entire stories of the building or residential building was not really damaged other than the intended target, something, of course, that not many countries in this region have the capabilities for. Nevertheless, it seems like this is part of additional strikes that were also carried out in Lebanon against various Hezbollah targets. And as General Kimmett mentioned correctly, there is a call here in Israel, particularly also from the civilian population, to help the 61,000 residents of northern Israel that were urged by the government to leave their houses and move elsewhere into southern Israel or central Israel, different locations, as well as roughly 40,000 who also left beyond those 5 kilometers from the border and left their houses out of their own volition due to concerns of something like what we saw on October 7th recurring north.
Yes, there is a difference between military logic, purely strategic considerations, and popular sentiment. If you look at it as a cold analyst, almost the way you presented it a moment ago, Israel can live with the consequence of a ceasefire in which Hezbollah does not withdraw, at least not initially. There will be no surprise. Hezbollah cannot emulate Hamas now because Israel will be on guard constantly. It beefed up the forces along the border. The Air Force would be on edge, and it would not be cost effective for Hezbollah to try and send the Radwan force to raid Israeli communities adjacent to the border. But this, again, is cold analysis. The popular sentiment drives those residents who are afraid to go home before there are guarantees, not just analysis and assessment, but guarantees that this will not happen, that the October 7th massacre will not be repeated in the north. And in order to gain that, Israel would have to do more, to get more, either militarily or diplomatically. And up to now, the Amos Hochstein mission in Lebanon, trying to find some formula in which Hezbollah will not lose face, may change some of its deployment, at least theoretically. Of course, it can always go back, while Israel will accept it. Up to now, this formula has not emerged. And the test will come once there is a ceasefire in Gaza. Hezbollah will then hold its fire, and the Israeli government will have to decide whether to initiate an expansion of the current war of attrition, which by then will be paused, and if not, how to convince the residents that it is safe to go back home.
Indeed, of course, not to forget that there are also roughly 100,000 Lebanese who've left the border towns on the southern part of Lebanon and have been dislocated into different places in Lebanon, that it puts additional strain on a country with a failed economy. So both sides have an interest to do so. Everybody's waiting to see what the main culprit, of course, has in mind, namely the Islamic Republic of Iran. But that's, of course, for later the discussion. I would like to highlight that we do have a geostrategic panel this evening on the situation in Lebanon, where Mr. Oren and I will host here Professor Uri Rosenthal, the former Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands, as well as the Lieutenant Colonel Sarit Zehavi, who is the founding director of the Alma Center that focuses all of its efforts on the Lebanese area of responsibility. But General Gavish, I'd like to ask you particularly, and if I may ask briefly, because I'd like also to touch on the situation in the Red Sea, and we don't have very much time to do so. When you look northward, what are the key notes that the Israeli public should take into account, considering the fact that there have been more and more statements coming out? Prepare yourselves, prepare that you have stored some dry foods, other commodities, water, in order to make sure that you are prepared for the possibility of an all-out war.
Well, indeed, Jonathan, this is exactly it. I mean, unfortunately, we all understand that there is a possibility that a full-scale war will be part of what we would see in the northern border of Israel, and we have to be prepared for it. And the Israeli public, which we have to say, is I don't know if the most disciplined in the world when it comes to those issues, but it is a very disciplined, I think, population. We saw it during the war and during the more than 12,000 rockets that were shot toward Israel. So the same population that knew how to prepare himself and how to behave toward the threat from the south would have to do it also toward the threat from the north. We all understand that this is a completely different threat. We all understand that the Hezbollah capabilities are more state capabilities. Probably it have the capabilities of the Hezbollah is larger than the vast majority of countries in the world. Mainly when it comes to rockets and missiles. So we would have to be prepared to it. We always talk about the grand strategy, how to fight it from a military point of view, on the attack, on the alert. But for the passive defense, this is the part of the civilians to go to the shelters, to prepare themselves. And indeed, all of those things, they should just go to the site of the Home Front Command. Everything is written there just to follow the orders.
Thank you, General Gavish. General Kimmett, I'd like to divert our attention to the Red Sea, since just over the last couple of days, we saw an MQ-9 drone being intercepted by the so-called Houthis, Ansar Allah. We saw two vessels incapacitated. We saw one vessel sunk, and additional vessels, including U.S. warships, being targeted time and again by this Iranian proxy at a time when an Iranian vessel, an intelligence vessel, so called, has redeployed in the direction of the Red Sea to continue and help and assist the Houthis in being more precise in their strikes against the United States. Can we derive from that Iran is directly helping the Houthis attack the United States and its allies and partners in the capacity, of course, of maritime shipping?
Well, of course, the Iranians will always say, as part of the axis of resistance, the Houthis are merely conducting operations on their own, by their own decision. Nonetheless, the fact remains that the Houthis would be unable to conduct this operation without the intelligence support, the material support, and in many ways, the on-the-ground support of the Quds Force. People say, well, what's Iran trying to say? And my answer is very simple. Iran is the father giving the gun to the son, giving the bullets to the son, and saying that's an enemy of our family right now to the son. But do whatever you want with this, but it's your, without saying that you should do that. Of course, all the incentives and all the capabilities are given there. All the motives and opportunities are given. So if this is a unilateral decision of the Houthis, the Iranians can hide behind it, but the complicity is direct, even if there is not a one-word attack given from Iran. It's obviously that Iran is far more complicit and certainly far more than responsible. I would just make one very quick point about Lebanon. Right now, Netanyahu is a reviled figure in the United States. The United States is in no mood to support, whether it's true or not, whether to support Netanyahu's ambitions to stay in power by starting a war that won't simply affect Iraq, but will affect that won't simply affect Israel, but will affect the entire region, and then by extension by the United States. So any notion of significant military actions into Lebanon will not be supported by the United States in the main.
There is no love lost between President Biden and Prime Minister Netanyahu at this stage, that's for sure. Nevertheless, I'd like to redivert attention to particularly the Red Sea and to comments that were made by Brad Cooper, Vice Admiral Brad Cooper, the Deputy Commander of U.S. Central Command, formerly also the Commander of NAVCENT within CENTCOM and the Fifth Fleet, who said, and I paraphrase, the RGC has its advisors, Iranian advisors, shoulder to shoulder with Houthi militants in Yemen operating against maritime shipping. Is that just telling them this is your enemy, or this is really taking a share of the attacks against U.S. assets and international maritime shipping at large?
Well, perhaps I wasn't clear. What I'm saying is there is complicity and responsibility on the Iranians' side. Whether that advisor turns to him and say, well, there's a target here, here's the weapon we gave you to use it, and is enough, or whether he says, now go attack it on our behalf. I candidly, I don't think that last sentence makes a difference. It's a distinction without a difference. Yes, Iran is complicit. They are responsible. They have provided enough motive and opportunity such that if they didn't make that final sentence of please attack it on our behalf, again, I think that's a distinction without a difference.
I think it's important to note that the European Union has announced now that it will also launch its own maritime task force in the Red Sea to coincide with Task Force 153 and the offensive component also, which the United States collaborates together with the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, Canada, and Australia, among others. And therefore, there is going to be a larger response. The main country that is currently hurt from the situation in the Red Sea is no other than Egypt, as well as Jordan is very much hurt by this situation, but Egypt and Europe at large. So this is something that, of course, is going to be an international response against this Iranian proxy. But this is all the time that we have for today. I'd like to thank General Kimmett, General Gavish, and Mr. Oren for your time on updating us on the latest, and I'd like to thank all of you at home as well. Until our next update from here in Jerusalem. Shalom.
I'm Eran Etzion, former Deputy National Security Advisor here in Israel, a diplomat, a strategist by training. I'm very happy to be at TV7 and offer my interpretation along my esteemed colleagues. The strong point of TV7 is to be a reliable source of authoritative insight in an era of shallow news environment that is very difficult for viewers to trust.